Now, you could say that any 50-year period is what shaped the future, and you wouldn't be wrong. This is my 50 years, my first 50 years. I was born in 49. This will be from 1950 to up to 2000. Some of the major events that took place, some of the crazy and odd things that happened. 50 years is a good chunk of time. A lot of things happened in that period. First president I remember is Dwight Eisenhower. And his big claim to fame, as far as I remember, was the interstate highway system, the Eisenhower interstate system. We didn't always have these I-75s and I-94s and I-90s and I-whatevers. I remember when we didn't have them. I remember when we used to travel from Detroit up to northern Wisconsin to see my mother's relatives, that it was all on secondary roads. There were no interstates. That's going back a ways. That's going back to the 50s. Around the mid 50s, around 57, was the introduction of transistor radios. I remember my brother and I for Christmas got transistor radios. I remember them being Motorola radios, little handheld deal with the dial on the side. It was all AM radio, and they used the little transistor, what I still call transistor batteries. You know, like the ones you have in your smoke detectors, your smoke alarms. I still call those transistor batteries. 1957 also saw the first satellite launched by the USSR. Sputnik was the name of it, and I remember when that was launched. First orbiting satellite. It was during the time of the Cold War, post-Korean War, started the Cold War between the USSR and the United States. Fear of nuclear annihilation. I remember being in grade school and having the not fire drills, air raid drills, where everybody'd line up and go out into the hallway and sit down and cross your legs and duck your head, duck and cover. Anybody remember duck and cover? That was supposed to protect us from the air raid. Mid 50s was also the time of fins on cars. How about the 57 Chevy? Arguably the most popular classic car, at least in that era. 57 Chevy, the big fins in the back. How about the 59 Cadillac? Big fins, dual taillights in the back. Pretty snazzy. 59 Chevy too. Had big fins, big round fins on either side. And then the 60 Chevy, they came up like that and then they squared off a little bit. Remember fins on cars? And kind of a personal thing to folks around the Michigan area was 1957 was when the Mackinac Bridge opened. Prior to 1957, to get from the Lower Peninsula to the Upper Peninsula, you had to take the car ferry. And I remember that too. Unless you went all the way around Lake Michigan through northern Illinois and Wisconsin, and came up that way. Early in the 60s, 1960 or so, gave us push button telephones. Up until that time, it was all rotary dial telephones. Not too many of those around anymore. And color television. Color television was early 60s as well. I remember in our family, I have a cousin, Jackie and Chuck, and they were the first ones in our family to have color television. And I remember seeing it and how the color was not real distinct. And you'd have color bleed. If something was red, the things around it, the edges tended to be red too. Wasn't perfect, but it was something new. First man in space was in 1961. Yuri Gagarin from the USSR. First man in space, did one orbit around the Earth. About a month later, the US put a man in space too. It was a suborbital, just a loop up to space and then back down. That was Alan Shepard, first US astronaut in space. 1963 gave us the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I remember that very well. I was in gym class in junior high school when that was announced. I remember it very clearly. A bad time. Big topic after that was, where were you when you heard? The 60s were also the time of the civil rights movement. I mean, obviously it had started some before that, but the big push for civil rights was in 1960s. 1964 was when the Civil Rights Act was signed. And along with the turbulence, that was also the Summer of Love in San Francisco. It bled over from San Francisco, but the main event was there. in 1964. The talk of the country in that age group was Haight-Ashbury. Everything was Haight-Ashbury. If you talked about hippies, you talked about Haight-Ashbury. It was an interesting time. A little bit later in the 60s, in 1968 specifically, we had the assassination of Martin Luther King. Another sad time. And to counter the sad time, in 1969, we had the first man on the moon. The United States put a man on the moon. 1969. That was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Talking about 1969, we can't forget Woodstock. That was a great time. Not that I was there. I was in the service at the time, but 1969 was Woodstock. Where were you in 69? Anybody out there make it to Woodstock in 1969? You'd have some stories to tell. Well, we made it into the 70s just in time for the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Remember the Watergate scandal led to his resignation? Remember, I am not a crook? Not too long after that was the end of the Vietnam War, 1975. The fall of Saigon. Remember some of the pictures from that time? It was not a very pretty exit. And then we had the U.S. bicentennial, 1976. Huge celebrations going on everywhere. You can't talk about the 70s without talking about disco. Remember the disco era? John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees. Disco always got a bad rap, but I always liked disco. A little later in the 70s, 77 in particular, gave us computers, personal computers. And at the time, we were talking about kilobytes and megabytes, not gigabytes and terabytes. And also in 1977 was the movie Star Wars, the original movie Star Wars. And I remember it being a sleeper. It wasn't highly advertised when it came out. But once it came out and people started seeing it, it went nuts. And it's still going nuts. Go back to computers a little bit. Remember the Atari 2600 console? That's touted as the first computer game console. I don't know if that's true or not. I was not a, never have been a gamer, so somebody out there will know better than I will on that. But the Atari 2600 came with joysticks and all the gaming hardware of the time, which is nothing now. And the 80s really had its ups and downs too. It started off in 1980 with the killing of John Lennon outside his residence in New York City at the Dakota. Early 80s was also when the AIDS epidemic came to the forefront. That was a pretty rough time for a lot of people. A lot of fear involved when that first came to light. The early 80s, 1983 was when the first cell phones became available, I should say, readily available. My first cell phone was a bag phone. You may remember the bag phones. They were a bag, canvas, or some kind of bag, about yay, had a big flap on it, and the phone was inside, and you take it out, and it was attached to the bag by a coil cord. But it was mobile. And shortly after the bag phones came the flip phones. I guess there are still flip phones out there, but the original ones didn't have big screens and everything on them. And it also kind of spelled the demise of the phone booth. Young folks now don't know what a phone booth is. That's pretty weird. Pretty weird to me. Then they went from the phone booths to the phone, I don't know what you call them, a little mounted on a wall kind of thing, kind of a little enclosure where you could talk. Won't see many payphones anymore. In the mid-80s, 1985 in particular, was when the Titanic was discovered. They've been looking for it for a while, but it was discovered in 1985. Remember the first pictures of the Titanic sitting on the ocean floor? And back to computers again, mid-80s was also when Windows was introduced. It replaced MS-DOS. If you remember MS-DOS, where you had to type in all the characters for every command you wanted to execute. Windows brought click this and click that. If I remember correctly, Windows was behind Apple in that regard. Later in the 80s, 1989, was when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound, Alaska, spilled 10 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound. That was a tragedy. Also in 1989 was when the Berlin Wall came down. Remember Ronald Reagan's famous Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall? And then came the internet. Around the 89, 90 time frame was when the internet became available to the public. The internet. Where would we be without the internet now? It wasn't always here. We didn't always have the internet. Also in 1990 was Desert Storm. Iraq invaded Kuwait. Not long after that was when the USSR fell. Became Russia again. In the mid-90s, 1995, we had the O.J. Simpson trial. Remember what a spectacle that was? Then later in the 90s, 1998, is when Google was born. Where would we be without Google? Look how far that's come. We didn't always have Google. And then, of course, we had the Millennium 2000. And that's where we'll end this little video, the millennia. I understand how much was left out of this. Believe me. Couldn't possibly mention everything that happened in 50 years. Those were just some of the highlights that I came to my mind when I put this video together. You're probably sitting there thinking, well, how could you leave out such and such? If you've got one of those moments, put it down in the comments. What did I omit that stands out to you? Like I said earlier, there are innumerable things that happened in a 50-year period. These were just some of the highlights, lowlights, if you will. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me reminiscing about the first 50 years. I appreciate you being here. As always, I always appreciate you being here. So come back. Hard telling what'll come up next. There's a reason I'm sitting here in the office doing the video this week. It's 22 degrees out and the studio is not heated. So I thought I would do my video indoors today. I hope that's okay. Well, it's indoors in the studio, but it's a cold indoors. We're experiencing a little cold snap here, so hopefully be back in the studio next week, or the week after, or the week after. In the meantime, peace and joy. Thanks for being here.